Hi, I'm Krista, and welcome to Wannabe Crash Course World History. In this episode, we're going to try to cover 250 years of history in 10 minutes, so let's get started. Year 1750 marks the beginning of both our video and the Industrial Revolution, which basically started everything. The Industrial Revolution began in England to manufacture textiles easier and faster. The Industrial Revolution led to all sorts of different things throughout history, one of the major things being the scramble for Africa, because they ran out of all the resources they had in Europe and they had to find new sources for these things. So Cecil B. Rhodes was one of the main proponents in this. He decided that because white man was greater than all others, quote unquote, that they should go to Africa and colonize the people there, and they just take all the goods that they had. So at the Conference of Berlin in 1870-something, they decided that they would cut up Africa like it was a cake, and they would give parts to everybody in Europe. These main people being England, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, even a little bit went to Germany. Everybody had a little piece of Africa. While there was European imperialism present in Africa, there was also imperialism in Asia during this time period. 1894 to 95, both Japan and China wanted to stake claim to the area of Korea. Now, this was only a one-year war because Japan managed to become victorious and beat China in a surprise attack. You go, Japan! Not only did they gain Korea, they also gained Taiwan, which was a big part of China's economy, so good on ya. The Sino-Japanese War happened exactly 10 years after the Sino-Japanese War, with kind of the same basic principle happening. Japan was defending its rights to Korea as Russia was trying to expand under Tsar Nicholas II. The same thing happened. It was 1904 to 1905. It only lasted a year, and Japan still emerged victorious. This was a war that actually proved Japan was a force to be reckoned with. You know, I'm not all that sure what Tsar Nicholas II was more upset about, losing this war or the allegations of his wife sleeping with Rasputin. And that brings us on to World War I. Yay! Not yay, because over 15 million people died in this war. Now, the scramble for Africa influenced things as well, such as World War I itself. I mean, with the scramble for Africa, nationalism increased and competition increased, and just all the European countries were at each other's throats like, when is this going to end? But it eventually started and ended when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was shot by a Serbian dude named Princep, and this was basically the straw that broke the camel's back and brought us World War I as we know it. Now, there were two alliances formed, the Central Powers and the Allied Powers during World War I. The Central Powers were made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, while the Allied Powers were made up of Britain, France, Russia, and Italy. Now, an aspect of total war is different kinds of wars styles, I suppose you could say. You could fight the war in trenches, there was war that was fought in the air in dogfights, there were tanks that were introduced, there were machine guns that were introduced, there were all sorts of new technological advances that you could use to fight people in this World War. Now, this war, said to end all wars, lasted 4 years, from 1914 to 1918. Half of it was probably unnecessary because they were sitting in trenches waiting for the other side of the fire. But it eventually ended in 1918 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. With all of these things happening, Russia decided that they kind of had enough, because during World War I, they had all sorts of civilian tragedies, seeing as they only had one weapon for every 3 people, and they had this new provisional government headed by Alexander Kerensky that was kind of downhill because everyone wanted them out of the war, but he kept them in, and so they decided to withdraw in 1917 with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk? Skylar, am I saying that right?
Brest-Litovsk.
Close enough. The Russian Revolution itself ended just a year after they decided to withdraw themselves from World War I. Now, the Russian Revolution started when Vladimir Lenin executed the royal Romanov family, who had been in power for the past, 200 years. And this kind of sparked an uprising between the people who were finally accepting the communism that Lenin was proposing and the people that were still loyal to the crown, even though everybody was dead. And this civil war lasted for about 3 years before the Red Army, which was the communists, finally beat out the White Army, which was the anti-communists and the Allies, because they had a leader by the name of Leon Trotsky, who was a brilliant general, and he managed to pull them out for the win and unify their army, while as the White Army was kind of disjointed because World War I was still happening. Now, also at the end of World War I, there was a thing called the Treaty of Versailles, and this was basically where everybody was like, what are we going to do with Germany? Because they caused the war, right? So they all sat down and they were like, okay, Germany, you're going to pay war costs, you are going to say that the war was all your fault, you are going to give up land and colonies, and you're going to give up all of these things because you did us wrong. After World War I, America adopted this isolationist policy where they're basically like, you know what, the rest of the world, cancel my subscription, I am through with your issues, I'm just going to stick with myself and I'm going to leave you all to your business. But we all saw how that worked out, right? Because the Second World War happened, and Korea and Vietnam happened, and America, you funny, just stop. Actually, not really. Hitler didn't invent fascism. Fascism was invented by Benito Mussolini in 1922, and then Hitler was just kind of like Mussolini's protege, and his ideas rubbed off onto Hitler, and Hitler was like, Sieg Heil, let's create fascism in Germany! And Mussolini was like, yo, bro, I got your back, it's all good, I can help you out with it. Now, the essence of World War II was Hitler kind of got a big head about being the leader of Germany. He was like, let's get some living space. Let's get some stuff for all of the Aryan race, the chosen people, if you will. But the Aryans he thought of were just blonde-haired, blue-eyed people from probably Denmark or somewhere. But the Aryans were really just migrators who were in Central Asia and by no means white with blonde hair or blue eyes. Now, Hitler was taking over all of this land called Lebensraum, or living space, for his Aryan race, and he started out with Austria, because Austria was German as well, and people recognized as German, so he wanted to unite all of the German peoples together in one big old republic, I guess you could say. And so he started out with Austria, and then he took over parts of Czechoslovakia until he was given entire Czechoslovakia for the promise that he wouldn't take over any more land. But he did. He took over Poland, and in September of 1939, that was the straw that eventually broke the camel's back, and that created the conflict that we now know as World War II. Now, in World War II, there were two different alliances like World War I. There were the Allied powers, which were pretty much the same. It was Britain and France and the U.S., but France kind of like dropped out after 8 weeks because Germany took them over. But the Soviet Union was also part of the Allied powers, which was really surprising. But once you take into account that Hitler broke the non-aggression pact with Stalin, and Stalin was so shocked that he couldn't talk for 2 whole weeks, you would probably be like USSR and be like, enough of you, Hitler, I'm out. And then the Axis powers were Germany, Italy, and Japan. Of course, Germany and Italy, Mussolini and Hitler, they were like this. And then Japan, they were like, why not? We have trading partners with these guys. Let's do it. Italy was kind of on the fence and moved back and forth for a little bit until they decided, you know what? Neutrality, son. No more. There was a period in World War II where nothing was really happening. It was in the winter of 1939 to the spring of 1940, and it was just called Sitzkrieg. You could probably infer what that means. Sitting on their butts, doing literally nothing, and then they're just like, oh, springtime, let's go back to kicking butt and taking names, right? I mean, it's a war, for crying out loud, people. There are two really important aspects in World War II that everybody really knows about. One of them was called Kristallnacht, which was a night where all the Nazis just completely obliterated everything that the Jewish held near and dear, like their storefronts, their homes. They killed people, 100 of them to be precise, and they just went around ravaging everything. And the other thing is the Holocaust. The Jews weren't really liked in World War II, or at all, to be entirely honest with you. So they just decided, you know what, let's round up all the Jews, let's get rid of all of them. That shows you what happens when you get megalomania and your name is Adolf freaking Hitler. Right after World War II ended, the Yalta Conference took place in 1945, and the Yalta Conference was basically Churchill and Stalin and the U.S. leader at the time, whose name I forget and is probably going to pop up right in here, thank you, is just getting together and talking about all the stuff that just happened after the war. And then and a direct effect of this Yalta Conference was the creation of the Eastern Bloc as kind of a buffer zone for the USSR. Stalin had said to Churchill that he would let the Eastern Bloc have voting rights and free elections, and Churchill was like, I call BS on you, sir. And Stalin was like, no, man, it's okay, I promise. Pinky promise, no crossies, man. And he was like, okay, I'll believe you. Stalin's like, psych! So at the end, he didn't give them voting rights, and the Eastern Bloc just basically became the basis for what was to be the Cold War. The Cold War started in 1945, and it didn't end until 1991, so it was basically just a 46-year-long thing, where it was the United States and the USSR going, I see your technological advance, and I will raise you something that you can probably top in about 5 years. The closest that the Cold War ever became to actually becoming a real war was the Cuban Missile Crisis. This happened in 1962. And basically what happened as a retaliation to the United States placing missiles really, really close to the USSR, with the help of Fidel Castro, managed to move 15 different nuclear launch sites into Cuba as a means to retaliate and to scare the United States. Those missiles, if they had the power, could launch anywhere in the continental United States with the exception of the far northwest. Now, these occurrences was probably the most tense that the war had ever gotten to becoming actually full-blown combat. But thankfully, they had managed to create a peace agreement. Kennedy and Khrushchev managed to work it out to the point where the United States would remove their missiles and Khrushchev would remove his. The closest that the Cold War ever got to becoming an actual war was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. This was when Fidel Castro in Cuba, the dictator at the time, decided to let the USSR bring missiles into the country. The missiles, of course, were unarmed, but the United States didn't know that, and they felt threatened. The Korean War happened between 1950 and 1953, and it was a conflict between communist and non-communist forces in Korea. At the end of World War II, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel into the Soviet North Korean part and into the U.S. So naturally, with the Northern Koreans being communist, and with the Soviet Union, and with the Southern Koreans being United States, and with them being non-communist, democracy, there's bound to be a couple of disputes, more than a couple, enough to cause a war perhaps. So the Northern Koreans first descended upon the Southern Koreans, and then they were like, no, let's fight back. And this went on for about 3 years, and finally just the boundary was drawn again at the 38th parallel. The Vietnam War was kind of like the Korean War in the sense that it was about communism versus anti-communism. It happened from 1969 to 1973, and it was under about the same basis. Ho Chi Minh was in the north, and he was trying to descend upon the south, and the Americans were like, nah man, the South is democracy, let's help them out. So the United States comes over and tries to fight, and they leave eventually because it's just futile. Resistance is futile after all, come on. So it kind of sucks because like right after the Americans left and Ho Chi Minh died, Vietnam became all communist. So the Vietnamese War was probably just a giant waste of time. It just prolonged the inevitable.
And Gorbachev was the leader of the Soviet Union during the 1980s. He was best known for his reforms. These reforms included democratization, perestroika, which was the restructuring of the economy, and glasnost, which was an openness policy. Am I hearing what I think I'm hearing? And so the 1980s in the Soviet Union, it could be comparable to the 1960s in the United States, with the whole openness, basically. Okay. And this whole perestroika deal was actually a big deal because, you know, it's supposed to be a communist state, but perestroika was bordering more towards a capitalist side, with a more free, open market policy. Under Gorbachev, the Cold War actually ended. It was with him and the President of the U.S., Ronald Reagan, that the Berlin Wall had been torn down. And so with the infamous words, "Mr. President, tear down that wall," the Cold War ended on November 10th, 1989. The USSR didn't officially fall apart until 1991, though.
So that's it. 250 years of history in 10 minutes.
Well, sort of.
Hope you guys liked it.
Bye.
Bye.